iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to a new episode of iGlobenews, our weekly video podcast where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Matner-Markov. I am editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org. I will be discussing with world-renowned China expert, Professor Susanne Weigel-Schwirzig. Our topic for today's discussion is Trump-Xi Summit, a global win-win outcome. And for the record, today is May 16th, 2026. President Donald Trump just wrapped up his two-day summit in Beijing. It was a much-anticipated meeting of arguably the two most powerful men in the world. Trump came with a huge delegation of business leaders, and China made clear that it had one issue: Taiwan. In a recent interview, you stated that President Trump, at the beginning of his presidency, wanted to isolate China and move the U.S. closer to Russia under President Putin. He met with Putin in Alaska and tariffed China. Yet this meeting in Beijing did not have any of the hallmarks of isolating China. In fact, Trump was very satisfied that, quote, fantastic deals were made. China, too, has highlighted the success of the summit. Global Times, a mouthpiece of official China, stated that the two leaders agreed to build a new vision for a, quote, constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability, end of quote. The two leaders reached consensus on major bilateral and global issues and engaged in, and I quote, warm interactions on multiple occasions. Although Trump called Xi a friend, no major announcements were made at the conclusion of the summit. Trump used the summit to focus on personal diplomacy and praised the beautiful roses. So why did isolating China fail? And as a top China expert, what is your assessment of the outcome of the summit?
Well, thank you, Diana, for this marvelous introduction to our topic today. I think it is quite interesting because, most journalists that interviewed me during the last days always asked this one question: who is the winner among the two? Is China the winner, or is the US the winner of this summit? And I think it is very, very interesting to see that both countries had different reasons to avoid giving an answer to this question. Nevertheless, I think the media were somewhat framed to think in those categories of winners and not winners. And they were also framed before the meeting even took place to think in terms of business rather than geopolitics. However, if you are a China expert, as I am, and you look very closely at what the Chinese say in this context, you realized immediately that for the Chinese, the business aspect was only an instrument in achieving and assessing political goals, while, as you mentioned correctly, the Taiwan issue was very, very much at the center of all this. And very interestingly, we don't have any robust statements about the Taiwan issue, and we also do not have any robust statements about the Strait of Hormuz issue. So this is very interesting. It does not imply that they did not speak intensively about this. I'm sure they did. But on the one hand, I must say that the Chinese actually prefer not to talk too openly about geopolitical issues. So they might have asked the US side not to speak too much about this part of their conversations. And at the same time, I'm also quite sure that they did not exactly reach a consensus, neither on the Taiwan issue nor on the Iran issue. And for that reason, I think it was also preferable for the US side not to speak openly about these issues, although maybe if you later on see the protocols of these conversations, you will realize that they mostly spoke about these issues and did not speak so much about these business issues. This is what they leave to their inferiors to talk about and find a solution. And they did find a certain solution. But it's very interesting to see that, these main issues, we don't know really very much. But what we do know is that From the Chinese point of view, this visit was very successful because President Xi claimed that the US and China are on equal footing and that these two major powers have the responsibility to preserve world peace. And Donald Trump, as the president of the US, did not come out with any kind of formulation that negated what Xi Jinping had said. So with other words, he did not say, hello, we are good friends. He did say we are friends, but he did not say, hello, we are on equal footing now and we'll share the responsibility for the world. Of course, he cannot do this because he hopes that the US can preserve its dominant position for the whole world. And because of that reason, he cannot accept or positively relate to a statement on the side of Xi Jinping saying, we are on equal footing. But on the other hand, he also did not say anything that made the Chinese side believe that the US would not at least accept this kind of wording, although they were not using it actively. So this implies, and I think when you read those through the Chinese press, you will see that they all stress, this is a very, very important milestone in US-China relations because we are on equal footing. And on the US side, I think they wanted to de-escalate the situation because they have enough to do in Iran and they still are in the middle of a lot of problems regarding Ukraine. So they do not want to have a third war theater in East Asia, and they want some kind of stability, and they want to create the impression for the world that the two major powers are not preparing for an immediate military conflict. So from this point of view, it was also preferable for the US-American side to collaborate with the Chinese orchestration of this meeting in the form that they also de-escalated the situation. And I thought was really interesting to see, usually President Trump, when he gives a speech, he talks out of the top of his head. He talks a little bit about this and about that. It's not very well structured, but this time he actually more or less read the text that they had prepared for him, which shows that he was under very, very strong discipline and that his entourage had actually prepared him to keep to this orchestration and to this discipline as much as possible, because every little move left or right could induce some kind of chaos and difficulties. So from this point of view, I would say that the title of today's conversation was chosen adequately. Both sides want to tell us that this was a win-win meeting rather than a meeting where one side won over the other.
Yes, and I just have this picture in my head of when they sat down to this nice lunch on this huge round table, because of course in China one sits on these round tables, and Xi Jinping sat down, and then you saw President Trump sitting down, and then he gave the lady behind him this huge white pillow, which was on his seat, and then all of a sudden Xi Jinping was so much higher than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was like very small, and then Xi Jinping was like higher on the round table, and I thought that was kind of interesting. I think Trump, in his usual manner,
Yes,
probably would have.
but you must realize, if I may interrupt you, the very interesting thing is that once the people in the room realized that there was this difference between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, according to my observation, they took away the white cushion also from Xi Jinping's chair.
Okay, excellent. Because I didn't see that part. I just saw the part where there was this huge difference in height. So excellent. So they were aware of that difference too, because there was really this huge difference between height on that round table. But of course, Xi Jinping used his meeting with Donald Trump as a display of his political, diplomatic, and symbolic power, culminating in a direct threat to Washington regarding Taiwan. President Xi said, "It is better to be a partner than a rival," and that the US and China should avoid the Thucydides trap. The term describes the dangerous, often violent structural stress that occurs when a rising power, like China, threatens to displace an established power, like the US. On his way back to the US on Air Force One, President Trump said he would talk to Taiwan's leader regarding the weapons deal. But China made clear that US support of Taiwan and even talking directly to Taiwan's president would violate China's sovereignty over Taiwan and could lead to a, quote, dangerous situation between these two powers. Trump has since given an interview to Bret Baier on Fox News, which is going to air or maybe just aired, and said China would be satisfied if the status quo with Taiwan remained as is, and that Taiwan should not seek independence. Taiwan also has made a statement since then, reaffirming the agreed weapons sale. So my question is, will Trump violate China's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan by directly contacting Taiwan's president? And how could China react if this happens?
You know what? I think very often the president of the US, despite the fact that he has this very, very important position in the political system of the US and in the world system, he sometimes says things for which he is not well prepared. So I think that he did not understand that he is not supposed to directly speak to President Lai Ching-te. And for that reason, he said, you know what, I will have to tell him something which is not so easy for him to digest. And for that reason, I will call him directly. This was his logic, because he speaks to presidents all over the world. And he thinks that if he speaks to them, he can convince them or coerce them to do what he wants. And for that reason, he said, you know, I'm going to talk to him and he will solve the problem. So what we actually gained from this sort of sentence he said on Air Force One is, first of all, he is still not so professional that he knew by himself that he cannot speak directly to President Lai Ching-te without harming everything he had just achieved in speaking to President Xi Jinping. Secondly, I think from this one sentence, we know that he will have to tell President Lai Ching-te something which is maybe not very positive for President Lai Ching-te, who not only wants to buy arms from the US, and this deal actually, at least half of it, is already more or less done. So it's not so much the past, but it's the future, I think, that the Chinese government wanted to talk to the US government about. And the fact that Donald Trump had announced publicly in February this year that he would be willing to talk to the PRC side about these weapons sales is already a break of a taboo, because since the 1980s, there was an unofficial understanding between Taiwan and the US that whenever they talk about arms sales, they would not include the PRC government into their talks, because from a Taiwan point of view, very clearly, once the PRC has a say in this becomes very, very difficult for Taiwan to manage, because obviously the PRC government has, in many situations, more leverage than the Taiwan government in talking to the US on a certain issue of geopolitical importance. So the fact that they talked about this is already quite negative for the current government of Taiwan. But if Trump says, you know, I will call him, he most probably will say something that Lai Ching-te doesn't like. So what could he tell him? According to my assessment, the most urgent issue here is the question of whether or not Taiwan can buy defensive weapons or offensive weapons from the US. So far, the US has very strictly observed this one sort of agreement they found with the PRC many, many years ago, which is that they are allowed to sell weapons to Taiwan, but these weapons need to be defensive weapons. But now the Taiwan government and the Taiwan military realize, by watching what is going on between Ukraine and Russia, that if in an asymmetric situation, the weaker actor can actually offensively go against the aggressor, and the aggressor is, like Russia and China, vast, huge country with potentially an enormous number of of objects that they could hit, then this implies that they can do a lot with offensive weapons, much more than they can do on the battlefield in trying to preserve their territory or regain territory. So the idea that the Ukrainians are developing with the help of the Europeans is we sort of try to hit Russia on its own territory as much as possible, so that we can actually bring the Russian government into enormous problems. And because they cannot manage the economic and social consequences of these hits, this government will eventually fall into pieces, and then they will not be able to continue their war. And it's the same kind of logic that now the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese military is developing. And for that reason, the Chinese side has to talk the US side into telling them we are not going to sell offensive weapons to Taiwan. And maybe Donald Trump more or less agreed to this. And if he did, then he will have to tell President Leichinga. So on the other hand, he did not say, we oppose the idea of independence. He still stuck to the formulation, we do not support Taiwanese independence. The Chinese would have liked for him to say we oppose. He didn't do this, and I think it is very clear that the US will never say this. But on the other hand, he might have agreed to a Chinese suggestion saying, please be sure that you do not sell any offensive weapons to Taiwan. And this is the part that he will have to communicate with President Leichinga, according to my assessment of the situation. Yeah, but this is, of course, in the realm of speculation, because both parts have very good reasons not to communicate this publicly.
And of course, both parts have very good reason not to escalate the situation between China and the US. And if one sees what just happened in Ukraine and now what happened in Russia, I mean, there was this horrible attack in Ukraine where 24 people died, and now the Ukrainians launched like 150 drones into Russia and also struck an apartment building there. So at the end of the day, it's really the civilian population that is suffering when these offensive weapons come into play. So it's a really tragic situation. If that's the European system of trying to beat Russia, I'm not sure how happy the Ukrainian people or even the Russian people are going to be in the long run, because they're going to be the ones who are going to be hit by all these offensive weapons.
That the geography of China is a little bit different from the geography of Russia. Russia has a vast territory and a comparatively small population. China has a vast territory and a very big population, which is actually concentrated in, say, 30% of the country. So if they have long-range offensive weapons, they can actually reach all those areas in China that are densely populated, that are sort of the centers of industrialization in China, and which are, of course, also the richest areas of China. This implies that if they hit one object, the consequences will be even bigger than in the case of Russia. And this is the reason why the Chinese government gets really, really nervous. But at the same time, it's also the reason why they are now obviously de-escalating. So I think that this meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping was very important also from this point of view, because Xi Jinping said, if we don't manage our relationship well, we'll have a war on Taiwan. He didn't say this as openly as I say it now, but this was insinuated by what he said. So, for example, he said, only if we manage our situation well, can we do good things for the world? And if we don't manage our relationship well, this will be of enormous detriment for the world at large, right? And so I think by this he was saying something that I think so far in official rhetoric from the PRC, they would not say this as openly as he did this, because under usual condition, the first sentence that every president of the People's Republic of China relating to Taiwan needed to say was, Taiwan is a totally domestic issue, and no country that is not China has the right to interfere into our internal affairs. This was the usual rhetoric. But this time, according to my observation, and I listened to his speech and to his speeches, he did not mention this. So I already observed that China was a little bit changing its rhetoric with regards to Taiwan during the last years. And that, for example, after the elections of President Lai Ching-te in January of 2024, it was the Chinese Foreign Ministry that actually made a statement on this issue. And it was not the Bureau for Taiwan Affairs. So this implies that they were already preparing their own population and also the world for the fact that they would now be willing to acknowledge more than in the past that this is a big geopolitical issue. And with this visit and with Xi Jinping's speeches during this visit, they made clear that from now on, they actually regard this as what it is, a geopolitical issue. It might have domestic origins, but as of today, it is a geopolitical issue and it has to be treated like that. And so because of this reason, actually, this meeting was very, very important. And these very formulaic speeches were enormously important.
If it's okay with you, I thought I'd move now maybe to the business side of the meeting. For the U.S., business interests, of course, were in the foreground because, as we all know, between the U.S. and China, there's been a long simmering trade war between the two countries. After Trump's sweeping tariffs last year exceeded 100%, triggering a tit-for-tat between the two countries, Trump arrived in China with SpaceX and Tesla's Elon Musk, Apple's Tim Cook, and Goldman Sachs' David Solomon, to name just a few of the CEOs that accompanied him. China indicated an interest in buying U.S. oil and soy, and of course, 200 Boeing planes were ordered, with the possibility of ordering many more. Everything was left pretty vague, with no final statements issued by China. So my question is, was the summit a success for U.S.-China business deals?
Well, according from information that I have from China, which is actually written information, not, people telling me things, for the Chinese side, and I think also for the US business side, the most important success of this meeting with regard to its business aspect was that the moratorium in tariff war was actually now not only prolonged for another 12 months, but for 1.5 years. So there is more stability in the tariff regime between China and the US, which of course is very important for everyone doing business between the US and China. If you don't know, whether your tariffs will go up tomorrow, yes or not, there's at least some kind of stability. And I think this is also the symbolic value of this agreement, that they wanted to stabilize relations and wanted to somewhat make sure that you don't need to be afraid of a situation changing on an everyday or every week basis. Of course, we never know whether or not President Trump will decide into another direction tomorrow or maybe next week or maybe next month. And this is, of course, also true for the Chinese government. But to have come to this agreement at least gives a signal to the business world, both in China and in the US, that at this moment, both sides are not interested in escalating this issue. And I think this is an achievement. Whereas, for example, some people sort of discuss the issue. Originally, we expected the Chinese side to buy 500 Boeings. Now they only buy 200. So why is there a difference? So according to my assessment of the situation, the Chinese were actually looking at the business conversations between the both sides as a second tier level of this whole meeting. And they were using the business part to sort of indicate how happy or unhappy they are about the more political talks they had between the two presidents. So I think this is quite interesting. But I would say that, for example, the Chinese indicate to the US side that they are not totally happy, for example, about the outcome of the Taiwan issue conversations. And they show this by not ordering 500, but by ordering 200. things. In addition, I think we can see in China that they wanted to avoid that something will happen in the US with regard to the midterms elections that would be very much to the detriment of President Donald Trump. So they wanted to give him some thing to take back to show, you know what, we are doing really fine and the US is great again. And very interestingly, President Xi Jinping says the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the idea that America should be great again, these two ideas are not in conflict with each other, but they complement each other. And we hope that the American people will be able to reach its aim of making America great again. Very interesting, you know. So he was not talking about, the US declining and here we are, waiting for a moment to take over. No, he said, we have the right to rejuvenate our nation and you have the right to make your nation great again. And we can do this both. And the planet is big enough for both of our countries to actually reach our aims. This business talks was of a secondary importance. But of course, I mean, for people doing business between the US and China, this is this is a very concrete and important issue.
Yes, so that goes along where the Chinese president said we shouldn't fall into this Thucydides trap. We should be partners and we shouldn't be rivals. But if you would now turn our attention to the other big issue, which of course was on the agenda, namely the Middle East. And as we all know, China has criticized the US-Israeli war. Xi agreed that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. China wants, though, to keep away from the conflict at present and doesn't seem too inclined to use its potential leverage on Iran. Of course, President Trump wants this conflict to end immediately. Probably given the choice, he wouldn't have started it in the first place. Now, Trump, interestingly, has accepted that 20 years of suspension of Iran's nuclear enrichment program would be enough. This is a shift from the previous U.S. hardline policy and maximum demands on Iran. This new statement by Trump, of course, will not make Netanyahu happy. Israel clearly does not want to move an inch on this issue. Also, we have to mention that as of early 2026, the IAEA found that Iran has not fulfilled its NPT Safeguards Agreement obligations, specifically failing to give the IAEA inspectors full access to the Iran nuclear facilities. Well, the IAEA board passed a resolution in 2025 finding Iran in non-compliance. So the question is, will a future deal mirror the JCPOA, which, of course, the U.S. under President Trump 1.0 pulled out of? Iran would be able to enrich on a low level in exchange for sanctions lifting. Is JCPOA 2.0 a possibility? And how will Iran's NPT non-compliance affect future IAEA, Iran, and U.S.-Iran agreements?
Well, from my point of view, if I were in a position of an Iran leader, I would come to the logical conclusion that because our country is experiencing this kind of war, we need a nuclear weapon. So this is, I think, very logical. And if Iran shows that they actually move away from this logical conclusion, or one should say maybe do not intend to move towards this logical conclusion. Because in the past, Ayatollah Khamenei, who was actually murdered by the Israelis at the beginning of the war, as we all know, he had made the decision that Iran would not have a nuclear bomb. So he had already given an interpretation of the main documents of his faith by saying that the Quran does not allow for Iran to have a weapon of mass destruction like the nuclear bomb. So they killed him. So this implies that now new people can interpret the Quran, right? And new people can say, maybe we can or we cannot. And politically speaking, it would be absolutely logical for Iran not to have, for Iran to have a nuclear bomb. So what I think, the question of whether they can enrich, yes or not, is, of course, a very important question, because if they cannot enrich, then they can never have a nuclear bomb. So many people think that if you don't allow them to enrich, then they will never have a nuclear bomb, which I think technologically speaking, might not be the full truth, because if they want to have a bomb and if they need a bomb, they can also get enriched materials from other countries. This I'm quite sure. So the enriching problem is more a backup or symbolic problem. All in all, I think that the international organization that had to supervise Iran was not allowed to have full access to all these different facilities, because I think Iran was right in not trusting this organization anymore. For example, the CIA said, we are pretty sure that they are not developing their capacity to the point that they could have a nuclear bomb. And at the same time, the international organization said, they are not complying. I think that the organization might have been caught in a political game here. And because the Iranians realized that this was so, they had every reason not to give them access to their facilities. We just learned that, there is so much technological possibilities prepared, for example, by placing certain sensors. For example, people from this organization go to a facility in Iran and they just happen to place a sensor someplace, which would then make it much easier for any bombs to actually reach these facilities. I think the Iranians, you might like them or not, we can very well understand why they would not give full access. On the other hand, I don't think that they can easily go back to the agreement from which the U.S. side actually walked off. Why? Because they know now that if they're not strong enough, even if the war ends for a certain period of time, there is reason to believe that Israel cannot be satisfied with the outcome and has to go on until it has reached its aim of destroying the political system in Iran. For that reason, they cannot sort of just go back to the original agreement. And for that reason, I think the international society and the UN, for example, has to think about alternative solutions. For example, I think that one could convince Iran to really stay away from developing their nuclear bombs for the next 20 years to come, and for not enriching their materials to a higher level than maybe 3, 4, 5%, which you need for your civilian use, if you actually established a nuclear umbrella over Iran. And I think this is maybe an orientation one might see coming up during future talks between Iran and the US. For example, if you allowed Russia to act as a nuclear umbrella for Iran. So this would, of course, be very much in the interest of Iran. It would be very much in the interest of Russia. Unfortunately, it's not in the interest of the US, and it's not in the interest of Israel, right? Because the US and Israel are fighting against Iran because they want to make it impossible for Iran to claim dominance over the region. But if they have the backing in form of the nuclear umbrella of Russia, this implies that actually Iran is stronger than before, and it has the explicit backing of Russia. So Russia would actually be more important for the region, and Iran would be more important for the region, which would then imply that Israel's plan to preserve its security by dominating the region would have failed. And for this reason, this very logical solution, if you have a nuclear umbrella for Iran, Iran doesn't need a nuclear bomb. This is very logical, very easy solution, actually a convincing solution. But under the given circumstances, I think, unfortunately, neither the US nor Israel would be willing to actually accord to this kind of idea. So this is, of course, very unfortunate because very often you don't have obvious solutions that you can revert to. You simply don't find a solution at all. But in this case, I think there is a solution on the table, but it will not be accepted, at least under the given conditions.
But of course, it was the US and Israel that opened this Pandora's box and can control what's happening now. If they want to keep Iran inside the NPT framework and allow Iran to be part of this NPT agreement, then of course they have to allow Iran to enrich for peaceful purposes. So they can't say you're not allowed to enrich at all. And of course, there's always the danger that Iran will go the way of North Korea. That'll say, okay, see you later. I'm leaving the NPT and that I've had it. And your guys are never coming here again. And very interesting what you said about you can't trust the inspectors. I think about the parallel to what happened in Iraq when, of course, the U.S. claimed weapons of mass destruction and sent all these inspectors there who were UN inspectors, actually. And it was proven that some of them were actually spying. I think Iran studied that very carefully and said, well, that's not going to happen to us. We're not going to let them spy. It happened in Iraq and it maybe happened in Iran as well. And so maybe the cautious reaction of the Iranians can certainly be understood. If we go to the other big issue, which is dominating headlines, it's of course the whole issue of energy. And we all know that 90% of Chinese oil comes from Iran. Xi and Trump were in agreement that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open and that there should be no toll. Yet China will not pressure Iran to give into U.S. demands regarding Hormuz. Iran's Foreign Minister Arakchi, in a statement in New Delhi during the BRICS summit, said that Iran does not trust the U.S. because the U.S. flip-flops all the time with conflicting messages. Arakchi nevertheless said that Iran is open to a diplomatic solution. Let us also not forget that the U.S. and Israel started the war against Iran while the U.S. was in negotiations with Iran on Iran's nuclear program. During the Trump-Xi summit, there was little movement on the question of Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked by the U.S., and so even when Iran lifted its own blockade, the U.S. refused to lift its blockade. So the question is, will China continue to support and arm Iran, and how could China help open the strait?
Well, there are lots of really conflicting information coming out from China about this issue. And it is quite clear that now the US is trying to frame our perception of what they had achieved in talking to China on this issue, while China is actually keeping mute. They don't say anything. I think, given the fact that in the past, especially when President Trump made utterances about certain things that he achieved in conversations with other leaders of other countries, we very often had to find out that he was actually sort of telling us what he thought should have been achieved rather than what was achieved and what was actually the consensus between the two sides. So I think as long as we don't know what the Chinese side actually says about this, at least I have not found any utterances from the Chinese side so far, I think we should be very, very careful. And we can only look at the situation from a structural point of view. So first of all, is it possible that the Chinese government agrees to saying the Strait of Hormuz should be open and there should be no toll? So I think it is possible that China wants this. Why? Because we see that now with the Strait of Hormuz being under such an enormous amount of observation, other places, other choke points in the world try to establish the idea that they might also establish toll booths and get toll from the vessels that go past their straits. For example, the Strait of Malacca is such a strait. And we know that there are intensive talks about these issues. So this would imply that when vessels go from East Asia to Europe or from Europe to East Asia, they will not only have to pay toll, but it will also take much longer for them because, of course, this is an interruption, or at least will be staged as an interruption of the whole journey. So China doesn't want more costs. It's already very costly now to transport your products from one end of the world to the other. They don't want to be part of this. So it is possible that they don't want this toll to be paid. And at the same time, they also realize in China that if the Iranians actually want toll for the vessels which pass through the Strait of Hormuz, then this would imply that the US and Israel, which actually destroyed Iran by their bombings, would not pay a lot, whereas clients from Asia and from Europe, which obviously did not participate directly or even indirectly in destroying Iran, would pay for the damage. And I think it is very important for China to show that they understand that this is a major problem, both for European clients and for East Asian clients, especially Japanese clients. So it's also political that they show this toll idea is maybe not the best idea. Iran said that they are willing to accept toll only in currencies other than the US dollar, which of course implies that at this moment, if any vessel pays anything to Iran, they pay in yuan renminbi, so in Chinese currency, which of course would be good for China. However, there is such an enormous demand for yuan renminbi now that people know that they will have to pay in yuan eventually, that the yuan, which is not an internationally convertible currency, has enormous pressure because demand is much higher than what is actually on the market and what the Chinese government can actually provide. So for that reason, China is also a little bit hesitant to sort of allow this to happen, because they actually do not want for the yuan renminbi to internationalize at a very fast pace, because they feel that if the yuan renminbi becomes an international currency, then there is much more leverage from outside to have an influence on the economy in China. And they think that the Chinese economy is not prepared for this at this moment. So you see that there are conflicting ideas. And as there are conflicting ideas, I would hesitate to say, China is now putting enormous pressure on Iran to stop controlling the Strait of Hormuz. I would hesitate to believe this. And even, if the US American side says, China has agreed to doing this, I would say, maybe they used a formulation that the Americans can interpret in this way, but which does not really reflect what they are thinking.
And of course, in addition to rising energy prices caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, there is a worldwide shortage of fertilizers because of the blockade. This shortage is leading to higher food prices and jeopardizing food security, especially in African countries. Countries like Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, who rely heavily on fertilizers from the Middle East. And China has a special relationship with African countries and has recently cut all tariffs for all African countries except for Eswatini, which maintains ties with Taiwan. So China is positioning itself as a liberalizer of trade and Africa-friendly economic partner, in contrast to Donald Trump and the US, which imposed reciprocal tariffs of up to 30% on some African nations in August of 2025. Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te finally arrived in Eswatini days after his government said a trip had been canceled due to China pressuring African countries to stop him flying over their territories. So some experts are saying that China is instrumentalizing its ties with African countries, showing how relations with China will be if Beijing rules are not followed. So how will China deal with famine caused by the blockade in Hormuz? Will African countries who have close ties to China expect China to increase the pressure on Iran to open up the strait?
Well, I think it is also in in the Chinese interest, and not only because it wants to help the African countries to actually control the situation. It's also in the Chinese interest to say that this closure or partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz can go on forever. because there is one fear that the Chinese government has, which is the fear that if the energy shortage really becomes a big issue, and this will start being the case in July of this year, it's not so very far away from now. That if this energy issue becomes a really big issue, this will then have an enormously negative influence on the world economy at large. And I think, according to the assessments of Chinese experts, in this situation, we can actually sort of be prepared for a world economic crisis that is as consequential as the crisis in 1929 to 1931. So this implies that, we know very well that this crisis later led to the Second World War. It led to many, many upheavals inside societies all over the world. So it was not like the 2008 financial crisis that could be contained to a certain degree. This world economic crisis that we might need to anticipate if the issue of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz will not be solved by July is of enormous consequences. And this is, again, an enormous threat for the stability of the Chinese government and the more or less stable relations between the government and society. Because China is a country that relies on exports. China is a country that relies now more and more on exports to not so very wealthy countries, because the US has been reducing its imports from China, and the EU also tries to reduce its imports from China, right? So China is in a situation where it diversifies even more than before, and this implies that it also diversifies into countries of the global south. Countries of the global south have to struggle enormously with the rising energy prices, and, as you just mentioned, for example, also with the fertilizer prices. So I just talked to a CEO from a company that actually produces nutrition. They said so far, because they have stockpiles, they don't feel the stress. But starting from the second half of this year, things will become very, very difficult for them. And this is true for many, many companies that trade or produce nutrition all over the world. And for every single farmer who is actually producing the things that you need in order to make eatable things out of it. So it's very, very interesting to see that China can now say, we cannot put too much leverage on Iran, because we know very clearly that Iran doesn't like for any country to put leverage on them. They get very rejected if you try to coerce them. But on the other hand, it's also in their own interest to find a solution as soon as possible, because they anticipate that otherwise the whole world will fall into economic crisis, which will be very, very difficult for China to take, because if they do not export, then their own economy will run into enormous problems, because internal demand in China is very, very low, and there's no sign for people to be more willing in the future to spend their money than in the past. So export is the only cushion that they still have for their economy. And if a worldwide crisis makes this export get smaller rather than bigger, then this would imply that the number of unemployed in China is rising again, and that people are unhappy, unsatisfied, and for that reason, the stability of society is in danger. So they will work on a solution as soon as possible, I would think.
Yes, because we in Europe, we are lamenting the rising price of gas, the rising price of our food in the supermarket. But of course, these African nations, they're just going to have a famine, which of course is a whole different level of seriousness than just having to pay €2 more for your milk, which is always available. Much different situation, which is going to be life-threatening to huge swaths of their population. Let us stay in the Middle East a little bit longer. So while Trump and Xi were having their, I don't want to call it love fest in Beijing. We had other talks going on, namely Lebanon and Israel in Washington on May 14th and 15th. They also had another round of talks, and they agreed to the cessation of hostilities, which were extended for another 45 days. Yet Israel keeps striking southern Lebanon intensely and killing Lebanese. 3 paramedics were killed by Israel within the last 24 hours. Another 2 people were killed as well. And it doesn't seem like the U.S. has any control over Israeli actions in Lebanon. Beijing has made clear that Lebanon's sovereignty should not be violated and that the safety of civilian lives and property must be guaranteed. China, again, is standing up for human rights and international law, while the US and Europe are turning a blind eye because it, again, involves Israel. So, will any agreement between the US and Iran include Lebanon and Israel? Iran will surely not agree to any peace which does not include Lebanon.
This is very, very true. And I think we have already learned from the case of the war in Ukraine that even if the US wants to end a war, the end of the war will not come unless all parties agree to end the war. And I think in this particular situation, we have to face the fact that Israel, because it feels an existential threat from the existence of Iran, will not agree to ending the war in a way that would really end the war. So Israel needs to comply with the wishes of Donald Trump, and therefore they agree, for example, to prolong a ceasefire with Lebanon. But at the same time, they know very well that they have their own ends and they're actually using the US. And because they're using the US to reach their own aims, they also have to comply with certain wishes that come from Washington. So, from my point of view, the situation is really very, very dangerous because not only does Israel not really want an immediate peace. From Iran's point of view, their capability to actually lead a prolonged war is there. They can actually build on their stockpiles. They can build on the fact that their population is more willing to go with the government during war times than during peace times. And for that reason, as the situation also within the Iran elite is at least very complicated, for them, there is no big incentive to immediately end the war unless they are given so much as a signal of them being victorious in this war that they can actually say, okay, now everybody has to acknowledge that we won the war, that the US lost the war, that Israel lost the war, and because of that, we can now end the war. But of course, neither the US nor Israel are willing to give in and acknowledge that they lost the war. So this is really a very, very dilemma situation. And I think we will have to wait for more things to happen so that more than one part of this triangle will actually need to end the war. Right. So if you're 1 against 2, I think it is under normal conditions inconceivable that this one actor, even if it is as powerful as the US, will be able to force the other 2 into peace. And I think only if at least one of the other 2 comes into a situation where it sees the sustainability of its state and government under threat, then I think this actor will unite with the US in asking for an immediate peace. But this will not happen within the next days to come, according to my assessment.
But maybe this summit in Beijing kind of moved that shovel a little bit further, because one did see now the willingness on the part of Foreign Minister Aragchi saying, okay, even though we really don't understand and maybe trust the US, we're still open for a diplomatic solution. So maybe Iran will be more willing to discuss with the US. We know the US definitely would like peace in the short run, let's put it that way. So the whole question remains, will the US be able to put enough pressure on Israel to accept the terms, whatever they may be moving forward. I'd like to go back to something you mentioned regarding China's economy, which is suffering at the moment because, of course, China's rise is based on trade and economic developments. Trade needs no wars and a stable world order. In the first 2 months of 2026, China's export grew by 21.8%, reflecting a reorientation towards non-US markets, as you have already mentioned, and that's helped cushion the impact of the declining trade with the United States. The last summit of the Shanghai Trade Organization was held in 2025 in Taijin, China. It focused on new development strategies, and there were a bunch of bilateral agreements which were concluded. The US, of course, is a member of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is also called APEC, which engages in economic cooperation across the Pacific Rim and focuses on trade and investment initiatives. So, what role is the Shanghai Trading Organization playing in China's plan to expand its power through trade? And is the SCO a major pillar for China to project power and policy? And does APEC provide the U.S. benefits similar to those the SCO provides to China?
Well, this is a very interesting question. So I think APEC and SCO are two totally different settings. And I think APEC has been an organization which only is similar to SCO in the sense that they have summits, and the summits are there to discuss issues on a multilateral and bilateral basis. So this is also true for SCO. But SCO actually is a regional organization that has changed its aims several times since it first came into being, first in 1995, then in 2001. And I think it is actually a Russian and Chinese and Indian organization that tries to organize the sphere of influence of these three countries, especially in Central Asia, but now reaching out to other parts of Asia, including the Near East. So from this point of view, I think that this organization, although it is like a dialogue platform at this moment, has actually the potential of developing into a common market, which is something that China is pursuing, or even a military alliance, which is something that Russia is pursuing. So, but they have not yet decided, and India will play an enormously decisive role in either backing Russian plans or in backing Chinese plans. And as India and China are not very good friends, there is reason to believe that eventually, if the world becomes even more conflictuous than it is at this moment, maybe India will opt for the Russian solution. Whereas APEC, of course, is a dialogue forum that talks a lot about everything, but never has any consequential decisions or something like this. It is a place where people meet and talk to each other. It's a very typical sort of Asian way of organizing the relationship between the leaders of different countries. But it's at the same time also quite important because the US needs APEC to make sure that it still has an impact on the countries in the Asia Pacific region. And they don't let China sort of take over the vacuum. So from this point of view, this is important, and we have to watch out for this. And of course, the next APEC meeting will be yet another occasion for President Trump and President Xi Jinping to meet. And we should not forget that their first meeting actually took place during an APEC meeting in Busan in South Korea last year.
And another organization which we need to mention, and where India plays an important role, is, of course, the BRICS organization, which just held a meeting in New Delhi. And this BRICS meeting, which just ended, did not come out with a joint statement of its members condemning the US-Israeli war in Iran. Both Iran and the UAE are BRICS members. The US is an ally of the UAE, and the UAE is directly involved in military operations against Iran. Let's also mention that the UAE left OPEC recently. The final statement of the BRICS summit did state that BRICS ministers, and I quote, recalled that the Gaza Strip is an inseparable part of the occupied Palestinian territory, end of quote. They also flagged the importance of unifying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip under Palestinian Authority. China officially supports the establishment of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders of East Jerusalem as its capital. China advocates for the two-state solution as the primary resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and recognizes the state of Palestine. So this is also what GCC countries are advocating. The U.S.-Israeli position against an independent Palestinian state will be a roadblock to a peace deal in Iran. How will China support the establishment of a Palestinian state? And do you think this was at all discussed during the summit, which just took place in Beijing?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that at this moment, India is the country that is running BRICS. So they take every year, yet another country takes over leadership. And we know which country takes over leadership by the location of their summits. So this implies we know that India is actually the country running BRICS this year. And what did Prime Minister Modi do? Only days before the war in Iran started, he went to Israel. He gave a speech with standing ovations in the Knesset. And he actually voiced his opinion, and he is known as a long-term friend of Premier Netanyahu. He said, we fully support Israel and its plan for its future, right? Okay, so because of this reason, there is no way for BRICS to come to a consensus on the Iran war issue, because not only the United Arabic Emirates will maybe not consent to what they suggest as a possible consensus, but India cannot support anything criticizing Israel. So this is the reason why BRICS is in a very difficult situation. And one of the reasons why China is so articulate in supporting the Gulf countries and in talking to Iran not to attack them and include them into the war is because China is very nervous about what could happen to BRICS if this issue actually draws the countries in BRICS apart. And if you read into the charter of the organization, of course, it says that no member country of BRICS should go to war against another member country of BRICS. And this is, by the way, also true for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So all in all, I think the situation for BRICS is not very good at this moment. And I fully understand that they don't have a joint declaration at the end of their meeting. So from a Chinese point of view, of course, they actually, I think, sort of pay lip service to the two-state solution, because they know that in those organizations where China plays a comparatively important role, including the UN, the majority of countries is in favor of a two-state solution. But if you look at the situation from a strictly realistic point of view, I think you must come to the conclusion that the possibility for a two-state solution to actually become reality is much smaller now than it was before the war against Gaza started. I think we have to have this in mind, that Israel will not consent to any two-state solution. This is not in Israel's plan. And if you put yourself into the shoes of Israel, you will come to the conclusion that this is not in the interest of Israel, and that this is one of the reasons why, although this plan has existed for such a long time, it has never become true. So I think the world has to be more imaginative to come up with a solution that can actually be accepted by the Palestinians, by Israel, and by other players in the region, which doesn't make the issue more easy to solve, because there's not only one additional player in the region, which is called Iran, but there is yet another very important actor that wants to have an impact on the region, which is Turkey. Yeah. So, so the situation is really very, very complex. And I feel that my hope for a so-called easy solution, which would be a two-state solution, is actually diminishing. And I'm quite sure, because I know that at least the experts in China are thinking in a strictly realistic theoretical context. So I'm quite sure that they know that realistically speaking, chances for a two-state solution are very, very low. But I also think that it is quite typical for China to be unable to come up with an alternative solution. They're not very imaginative with regard to this.
So, on a side note, as of May 2026, Israel is widely reported as the most unpopular or disliked country in the world. So, maybe things have changed for Israel despite it trying to control the narrative. It has not been very successful at this. But as a final question, let me move back to China. A recent Gallup poll suggests a significant shift in global public opinion, with China gaining popularity over the United States in many regions. Approval of U.S. leadership fell to 31% in 2025, and China's rose to 36%. Younger respondents, those are respondents between the ages of 18 and 24, are more likely to prefer Chinese leadership, with China and the U.S. nearly tied in popularity within this demographic. The rise in China's popularity is also due to its strong support of the United Nations, international law, and the world order. So, how will China use this popularity to increase its global influence? Will the world profit from increased Chinese influence? Or will especially poorer nations fall into what is now known as the Chinese debt trap?
Well, I think it is quite interesting that things have turned around so much, because if you looked at the situation a few years ago, the press was so negative. Media all over the world had so many negative things about China to say that sometimes one could even say, this is like a big propaganda push against China, and China has no way to push back. Now they are in a comparatively good position because, as we know, both Russia and the US are in a war, in the middle of a war that is not developing any signs of victory or a definite victory for both of the big countries. The only country that is advocating peace, that is advocating stability and economic development, is China. And China is playing this role quite skillfully. I would usually say that China is comparatively weak when it comes to soft power. If you compare, for example, with the standing soft power of the US in the past, and you compare this with efforts on the Chinese side to build Confucius institutes all over the world, my gosh, I mean, they spent so much money, but the outcome was never, the intended outcome, even the opposite. Right. So China is not very good in using its soft power. And I don't think internationally, they also don't have people that tell them what they could actually use as soft power. And in their own country, they seem to have a problem to identify this. But now they're in a good, objectively speaking, they're in a very good position. And subjectively, they're using the fact that the two other superpowers are in the middle of two wars, that they can stand, and say, okay, look at us. We are peaceful, right? So from this point of view, I think China is in a good situation. I would personally think, and it is quite interesting to see that many Chinese experts in China actually support this idea, that China is not the country that is strong enough, that has enough human resources, and that has a philosophy that allows the country to rule the world the way the US has been ruling the world during the unipolar moment, of which the US might think we still have not reached the end, whereas other people already declare the end of this unipolar moment and say we are already in a multipolar world. So the Chinese have a philosophy that makes them think in binary codes. So a three triangle situation for them is not the thing they really like. What they like is a binary constellation. And this binary constellation has, if you look at it from a political science point of view, and if you look at it from a historical point of view, you can see by the Cold War that the binary constellation is comparatively stable, and it has the consequence that both superpowers ruling the world have to rule in restraint. They always know if they coerce other countries, they might push these countries to the other side. And if the other side has more and more support, then obviously, as a zero-sum game, then the side which is pushing other countries into coercion will eventually end up being weaker than the other side, right? And because of this reason, I think it's very, very important to understand that the binary solution, as we encountered it during the Cold War, from a Chinese point of view, and I think also from a structural, realistic point of view, has many advantages to it. Whereas the multipolar world, especially if you have many poles, multiple poles, and you don't have a hierarchy within these different poles, is a very volatile situation through which we went between World War I and World War II. And we see that this multipolar situation did not solve the problem, but actually prepared the ground for World War II to happen. So the multipolar situation is a very delicate and precarious situation, and it has to be managed very well so that it doesn't evolve into a kind of volatility that might produce war. At the same time, it seems to me that this multipolar situation is inevitable if you want to go from a unipolar situation to yet another new world order. And so multipolarity gives you the possibility not to use war to establish a new world order. Because if we look at the 20th century, we know that if the world order is in disorder, probability of a world war is very high, right? So we have to invent something to manage this transition period from a unipolar to something else world, right? And I think that multipolarity is a good bridge between what we had in the past and what we might have in the future. And from a Chinese point of view, this is very important. I think most people in Europe think that you can only change the world order by replacing the US, and the country that should replace the US can only be China because it's so enormously powerful. I think this is wrong. First of all, the Chinese don't want this because they realistically assess their own strengths and weaknesses. And in this case, I must say they are right. Secondly, it's not good for the world. So if only one country rules the world, we see what has been happening since the end of the Cold War. This country has no need to act in restraint. So this country will eventually come to a point of overreach, which is what we see with the US at this moment, of possible decline, and by losing its capacity to rule the world in a benevolent manner. So this one country taking over, I think, is not a solution we should actually wait for, or we should even fight for. And in this particular case, at this moment, the Chinese elite isn't even prepared to replace the US. And this is the reason why we come back to the beginning of our conversation and make one full circle, right? So this is the reason why President Xi Jinping said at the beginning of the summit with President Donald Trump, we shouldn't be enemies, we should be partners, and we should take over joint responsibility for managing this world. So this is a G2 solution that he wants. This has been the solution that China has been striving for since 2008, 9, 10.
So that would mean that it was a win-win outcome for the world at large, this summit, which took place in Beijing. Would you agree to that?
Yes, I definitely agree to this. Although, I'm a realist and I know that these kind of summits and they're the kind of conclusions they come to in written or unwritten form under the given situation with a president like Donald Trump as the president of the United States, I would say for the time being, this is a win-win situation, not only for the two countries involved, but for the world at large. And the main reason why this is good for the world at large is that somehow we know that for the time being, the US and China are not prepared to go to war against each other over Taiwan, which of course is also a wonderful message for the people living on Taiwan, for the people living in mainland China, and for everyone living in East Asia. And of course, it is also a good message for the people living in the US.
Well, I think that's a great final statement for our podcast today. Thank you, Suzanne. It was a wonderful, interesting discussion yet again with you. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our viewers before we close the session?
No, just thank you for your always excellent preparation and for your wonderful questions and remarks. And I hope that also our listeners enjoyed the show.
That I do as well. For our listeners and our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave positive messages regarding our podcast so that others can find us as well. And we look forward to sharing future discussions with you as well. Goodbye.
Goodbye.